And now, without further ado, I want to introduce tonight's guest speaker for the History Happy Hour. We have Nick Sacco, who is a park ranger at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. He regularly gives tours of Grant's St. Louis home, Whitehaven, and serves as the park's education coordinator. He conducts historical research for the park, and Nick has had several scholarly journal articles published about the Civil War era, including an article on Ulysses S. Grant and slavery that was published in the Journal of the Civil War Era in 2019. Nick holds a master's degree in history from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. So now I want to turn the screen over to our guest. So welcome.
All right, well, thanks, Kelly. I appreciate the nice introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to see this presentation tonight. I am a park ranger at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. And it's not lost on me that today is Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. And I just want to take a minute to mention that St. Louis, where I live here, this was a center of treaty making in the early 1800s with various Indian tribes. William Clark from the famous Lewis and Clark voyage signed 14 different treaties with various Indian tribes, and lands stretching from present-day Wisconsin to Oklahoma were ceded from various tribes to the U.S. government, oftentimes coercively and under the threat of war. So a lot of land that is part of the United States today was ceded to this country from treaties here in St. Louis. And I highly recommend that if you're in the area that you check out Cahokia Mounds, an amazing site across the river in Cahokia, Illinois, that talks about the Mississippian people and their culture. The Mississippian culture at one time was larger than London. So definitely worth checking out when you're here in the St. Louis area, learning more about Indigenous history. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We are going to talk about Grant and slavery, and the house that you're looking at here, this funny looking green home, this is the historic Whitehaven estate. So we take care of a greenhouse called Whitehaven. And the home here, this house is more than 200 years old, having been built between 1812 and 1816. And this home was the childhood home of Julia Dent Grant, Ulysses S. Grant's wife. So this was the Dent family homestead in the years before the Civil War. Julia grew up at this house, and a young Army officer, Ulysses S. Grant, was stationed at nearby Jefferson Barracks, a military post about 5 miles south of Whitehaven. So while he's here in St. Louis, Grant is invited to visit with the Dent family at Whitehaven. He meets Julia. They fall in love. Ulysses even proposed marriage to Julia right on the front porch of that house. And for 5 years in the 1850s, Grant, he left the U.S. Army after 11 years of service, and he lived at Whitehaven for about 5 years and worked as a farmer on this property. And after the Civil War, Grant himself took ownership of Whitehaven and owned it for almost 20 years, including during his presidency. So it is my job to educate people about Ulysses S. Grant's life and times, particularly his experiences in St. Louis. Even though I only lived at the house for about 5 years, he's connected one way or the other for about 40 years of his life to the Whitehaven estate. And slavery plays an important role in the story of Grant's experiences here in St. Louis. Now, Grant has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. The famous author Ron Chernow wrote a book about Grant that was published in 2017. Chernow worked with Leonardo DiCaprio and a lot of other big name people to produce a documentary for the History Channel last year. Came out on Memorial Day 2020. It was reported that upwards of 3 million people saw the first episode of Memorial Day, which did include a little cameo from Whitehaven. But then interestingly enough, about 3 weeks after the debut of the Grant documentary, we also saw a Grant statue in San Francisco, California that was torn down. And one of the possible reasons for this that we were told was that it was because of Grant's connections to slavery and the fact that he was a slaveholder, and that is true. So I'm not looking to make an extended commentary on that particular moment, but I think it's just worth pointing out here that Grant's legacy, much like other historical figures like Washington and Jefferson, it's complicated. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of different ways to interpret it. And it's fascinating to sort of look at these different views of Grant over time. And it's interesting to kind of look at Grant right now when he's sort of a hot topic among scholars and the public at large. So the goal here is to sort of clarify more about Grant's relationship with slavery and try to dispel some of the myths and clarify the historical record a little bit. So let's look at some basics to start off here. Now, what we know about Grant's slavery, as I mentioned, the Grants lived at Whitehaven together as a family for 5 years, from 1854 to 59. And during that time, the Dent family, so Julia Dent, Grant's family, owned upwards of 30 enslaved African Americans in the 1850s. And the property itself was about 850 acres. So enslaved labor is central to the operation at Whitehaven, doing everything from cooking and cleaning to nursing the Dent children to growing crops to taking care of the farm animals. Grant himself, while living at Whitehaven, did own one enslaved man named William Jones. We also know that Grant freed William Jones in March of 1859, a few months before leaving the St. Louis area. However, we do not know how, when, or why Grant acquires William Jones. There's a lot of ambiguity in the historical record. And a large reason for that is that there are really no existing papers from Grant indicating his views on slavery before the Civil War. There are 32 volumes of Grant's papers that have been published. The first volume covers Grant's first 40 years of his life. There's only about maybe a dozen letters from Grant's time when he lived in St. Louis that are in existence. So long story short, there's just a lot about Grant's life in the years before the Civil War that is subject to debate and interpretation, just because there's not a lot from Grant's own perspective that is known in the historical record. And that has made it difficult to try to get a clear understanding of Grant's views on slavery before the Civil War. So historians, in doing research about Grant's views, they have tried to look at what contemporaries said about slavery and Grant and what Grant himself said about slavery. There was a woman named Louisa Boggs, who was a cousin by marriage to the Dent family. Louisa Boggs, during Grant's time in St. Louis, she sometimes helped to take care of the Grant children. She regularly corresponded with the Grant family. And after Ulysses S. Grant's death in 1885, she did several interviews in which she talked about Grant in St. Louis. And according to Louisa Boggs, Grant just wasn't cut out for life in a slave state. According to Louisa Boggs, Grant was too kind to his Negroes, quote unquote, and he just simply wasn't cut out for life on a slave plantation because he was just too nice of a guy. Another source that historians have used is an interview with Mary Robinson. For better or worse, we only have two recollections from enslaved people who lived at Whitehaven. Mary Robinson, she was interviewed the day after Grant died by a St. Louis paper, and likewise, Mary Robinson argued that Grant, he got into arguments with his father-in-law, Fredrick Dent, and he said at the dinner table that he wanted to free all of the slaves at Whitehaven. So this is another source that historians have used. And then Grant himself in his personal memoirs does talk at various points about the institution of slavery. Perhaps most famously, in the conclusion of the book, Grant says that the War of the Rebellion was started, it was caused by the institution of slavery. He also says of Robert E. Lee, he said that he felt bad kind of looking at Lee the day that he surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, but he also said that Lee and his men fought for one of the worst causes that a people could ever fight for. So looking at what Grant says in his memoirs, again, it's very easy to make this argument that Grant is strongly anti-slavery throughout his life. So historians have made various arguments. H.W. Brands in his biography said that, quote, Grant didn't believe in the institution of slavery. Joan Waugh argued that Grant was a Northerner alone and silenced in a world of slaveholders. Grant nursed a contempt for slavery and observed closely the habits of Southern white families in his part of Missouri. Ron Chernow argued that Grant was strongly anti-slavery, but at the same time couldn't really do anything about ending slavery at Whitehaven because most of the enslaved people were owned by his father-in-law, Fredrick Dent. There was even a rather extreme claim by an author named G.L. Coram, who argued that Grant actually may have helped in the Underground Railroad, possibly, because he came from Southwest Ohio, which was a hotbed of abolitionism and the Underground Railroad activity. Some historians like Brooks Simpson and Gene Edward Smith have been a little more cautious in their interpretation. I like that Gene Edward Smith pointed out that Grant was kind of ambivalent. He kind of wasn't really 100% sure what to do with slavery, but the majority of historians have made their claim that Grant was strongly anti-slavery. Now, when Grant moves to Whitehaven in 1854, he had been away from his family for more than 2 years. Grant was stationed in the Pacific Coast. His wife, Julia, and their 2 oldest boys were here at Whitehaven living with Julia's father, Fredrick Dent. The 2-year-old son, their second son, Ulysses Grant Jr., Grant himself had never seen this boy before. So he's going to leave the Army in 1854, largely because he wants to be closer to his family. Grant has a decision to make. His father, Jesse Grant, offered a job to Grant, offered him an opportunity to work in the leather goods industry, to go work for his father in Galena, Illinois. But Grant turns down this offer and instead accepts an offer from his father-in-law to come to Whitehaven and work 80 acres of land on the Whitehaven property. So historians have strongly really emphasized here that Grant is moving to Whitehaven for family concerns, to be closer to his wife and kids. But it's important to point out here that there's certainly an economic motivation as well. If Grant had any particularly strong qualms about slavery, he seems to have been willing to put those aside and agreeing to move to a slave plantation. And it is interesting to point out that Grant's father, Jesse Grant, claimed that he would never move to a slave state because he was so disgusted with the institution. So Ulysses clearly does not feel the same way, and whatever he may have felt, he is making a decision to live on a slave plantation and to work alongside enslaved African Americans on this property. Now, there's a really interesting episode that happens the next year that Grant is at Whitehaven in 1855. There was a neighbor of the Grant family named Richard Wells, and Richard Wells died. When he died, there was some confusion and there was some questions about the ownership of 3 enslaved African Americans that were owned by Richard Wells. What was going to happen with these enslaved people? So the Wells family and St. Louis County appointed 3 appraisers, and these appraisers were tasked with looking at the enslaved people and putting a monetary value on their bodies. It turns out that Ulysses S. Grant was one of the appraisers appointed to this 3-person commission. The 3 enslaved people were Bill, who was aged 26, Augustine, who was aged 18, and Amanda, who was aged 13. Bill and Augustine, Grant and the 2 other men with him, they put a monetary value of $825 on those 2 men. Amanda was valued at $600. And after the appraisers did their work, Bill was given to Martha Wells, Richard Wells's widow, his wife, but Augustine and Amanda ended up being sold on the steps of the St. Louis courthouse in downtown St. Louis. So this newspaper ad here, this is from 1855, and it says here that on Thursday next, the 14th instant, between the hours of 10 and 5 o'clock, I will sell at the north front of courthouse in St. Louis a fine Negro boy named Augustine, about 19 years of age, belonging to the estate of Richard Wells, deceased. Terms of sale, cash. So what do we make of this here? What do we make of Grant being an appraiser? Is he simply doing this because the Wells family asked him to? Is he doing it because he felt this was his obligation because the county had an interest in this? Or is there some other motivation at play? This is something we need to think about. If he's strongly anti-slavery, why is he participating in the appraisal of African-American, not only adults, but children as well? Now, if we go to a national focus, it's worth remembering that Grant is moving to St. Louis the same time the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed in 1854. Long story short, many of you probably know this story already, but the territories of Nebraska and Kansas are opened to settlers. And it's worth pointing out that these lands had been they had been ceded to, given to Indian tribes through treaties, but those treaties were violated. It was open up to other settlers. And Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the senator, when he's working to negotiate the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he wants to get support from Southern Democrats to build a transcontinental railroad across the country. But in order to get that support, pro-slavery Southern Democrats argued that they wanted slavery to be opened in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, because slavery had been previously closed off through the Missouri Compromise of 1821. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is very controversial because these lands that had been closed off to slavery from the Missouri Compromise are now reopened to possibly spreading slavery into new Western territories. In many ways, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is the birth of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln had served a term in Congress and had largely left the world of politics and was a lawyer, very successful lawyer in Illinois. But when he hears about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he is outraged and he re-enters the political sphere in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the reason I point this out, there's a couple reasons I point this out. One of those reasons is that in politics prior to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for the most part, partisan divides between the Whig Party and the Democrat Party were not usually along slavery. They're not usually along those lines. It's usually along economic lines, like government investment in internal improvements and in infrastructure, debates over hard currency versus paper-backed currency, debates over national banks versus state banks, a lot of economic debates between the Whigs and the Democrats. So when it came to slavery, the major political parties in 1854, you saw anti-slavery Whigs like Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and then pro-slavery Whigs like Zachary Taylor and Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy, who were together in a political party. And then you have anti-slavery Democrats like Salmon Chase of Ohio, and of course, pro-slavery Democrats like John Calhoun and Jefferson Davis in a party together. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act kind of provokes this change, this realignment within the parties. So we see the rise of the Republican Party, and the Whigs more or less kind of disintegrate at that point. Now, Ulysses S. Grant said in his memoirs that he had grown up a supporter of the Whig Party. He had grown up admiring Senator Henry Clay, but because of his time in the military, Grant never voted in a presidential election. So in 1856, this is going to be the first election where Grant is going to cast his vote. He's actually eligible to vote because he's no longer in the military. So the candidates in 1856, we see James Buchanan, who is going to argue in support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He supports popular sovereignty. He wants to leave the question of slavery's expansion to the territorial settlers of Nebraska and Kansas. He does not want Congress to issue a ruling on how slavery should expand into the West. We see John C. Fremont, the famous Pathfinder who goes out to the West. He's the first Republican Party candidate. He calls for a line in the sand, ending slavery's expansion. He argues that slavery can't be touched in the states where it's already legal, but he does not want to see it expand further into the West. And we see Millard Fillmore, the former president, who takes up the mantle of the American Party, AKA the Know Nothings. and largely campaigns on nativism. He wants to see federal naturalization law. He wants immigrants to wait 21 years before applying for citizenship, as opposed to 5 years as outlined in the Constitution. And the know-nothings, they did not have a strong position one way or the other on slavery. So Ulysses Grant can't vote for a Whig because that party's disintegrated. If he's strongly anti-slavery, he should vote for John Fremont, right? That is the anti-slavery candidate. Who did Grant vote for? James Buchanan. So Grant, later on in his memoirs, he is going to talk about why he voted for James Buchanan. And one of the things that he points out is that he was very concerned about the Republican Party's platform in potentially fomenting a civil war. He was concerned that the southern states, if the Republican Party won, they were just going to declare secession and try to leave the Union immediately. Grant said the following in his personal memoirs. Excuse me. He said, quote, "The Republican Party was regarded in the South and the border states not only as opposed to the extension of slavery, but as favoring the compulsory abolition of the institution without compensation to the owners. Many educated and otherwise sensible persons appeared to believe that emancipation meant social equality. It was evident to my mind that the election of a Republican president in 1856 meant the secession of all the slave states and rebellion. I therefore voted for James Buchanan for president." So this is just really interesting here. Grant is taking a very conservative approach, and he feels that James Buchanan is the only nationally viable candidate that would get support from both the North and the South, and that Buchanan would be the best course for staving off disunion. And as we all know, Grant was wrong on that front, but Grant sincerely believed that Buchanan was the best candidate for national unity. I love this political cartoon, though. This is from when Grant was running for re-election in 1872. People remembered that Grant had voted for a Democrat in 1856, even though he was a Republican president. And the cartoon here, we see Grant kind of in, kind of a farmer's outfit, a hardscrabble outfit. He's casting his vote. It says in the top right corner, "Vote for Buchanan, an extension of slavery." And to make the point even more evident, there's an ox cart behind Grant, and there's an enslaved man sitting on a pile of wood, alluding to how Grant oftentimes sold firewood to make ends meet for his family in St. Louis. So again, this is interesting. It doesn't necessarily indicate that Grant is strongly pro-slavery, but he did have a candidate to vote against slavery, and he did not choose that candidate in the only election he voted for in 1856. And Grant did say in his memoirs that he was not eligible to vote in 1860 because the Grants moved to Galena, Illinois that year, and Grant did not live in Illinois long enough to vote in that year's election, but he said that if he would have been eligible to vote, he would have voted for Stephen Douglas and not Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1860. Now, after a couple years living at Whitehaven, Grant is anxious to have his own sense of independence. He does not want to live in the same house necessarily with his in-laws. He decides to construct his own log cabin called Hardscrabble. So there's a picture of the Hardscrabble log cabin. It still stands today. It's actually across the street from U.S. Grant National Historic Site. It's actually managed by Anheuser-Busch Brewing Company at a place called Grant's Farm. But that log cabin, it's important to stress here, Grant did most of the work himself to be true, but enslaved laborers most certainly helped with the construction of the Hardscrabble log cabin. That point is not always highlighted when talking about this particular structure. The Grants ended up only living in Hardscrabble for about 3 months. Julia Grant hated it. She's the one that coins it Hardscrabble. And Julia's mother, Ellen, died in 1857. So the Grants eventually moved back to Whitehaven. During Grant's time at Whitehaven, he also participated in the hiring out system. Now, in cities like St. Louis, and I'm sure Richmond is a great example too, but sometimes slaveholders, they had enslaved laborers, they didn't have enough work for these enslaved people. One option could be selling them further south and making money through a sale on an auction. But a lot of times you would hire out an enslaved person to another person looking for extra help. So in the case of Grant, we see that during his time at Whitehaven, he does hire out enslaved African Americans from other properties to help out on the farm. And interestingly enough, there is one letter in Grant's papers where he talks about a young boy. And he said in this letter that this young boy was learning the farrier's trade. So he's learning how to take care of horses. And Grant offers to take this young African-American boy, this young enslaved boy, and take him to Jesse Grant, his father, to have him help out with his leather goods industry. But Grant says, if you don't want him, I'll hire him out to somebody else here in St. Louis. So Grant is saying, if you don't want him, I'll help out I'll make money off of this enslaved boy by hiring him out to somebody else here in the St. Louis area. So the hiring out system is very commonly practiced here in St. Louis, especially in the fall and the winter, in the non-growing season. Some large slaveholders would hire out some of their enslaved people to others in the St. Louis area. The Dred Scott decision, there's no direct connection to Grant, but I think it's interesting that the Dred Scott case began 12 miles away from Whitehaven here in St. Louis. Dred Scott files for his freedom. He files a lawsuit at the St. Louis courthouse in downtown St. Louis. And famously in 1857, the Supreme Court declares that Dred Scott is not a citizen. African Americans are not citizens of the United States. He had no rights by which the white man was bound to respect. And the Dred Scott case also argued that slavery's westward expansion could not be restricted either by Congress or the settlers in a given territory. So this tremendous Supreme Court case had its beginnings here in St. Louis, 12 miles away from Whitehaven. Okay, I want to point out here too that for a long time, we have a letter from Grant that he wrote to his sister in 1858. And Grant said in this letter that he had hired out 2 enslaved African Americans from other properties. And for a long time, we didn't know who these people were. Well, about 4 years ago, we actually found out one of these enslaved African Americans that was hired out by Grant. There was a prominent fur trading family here in St. Louis, the Sublette family. And Frances Sublette, she was the widow of Solomon Sublette. And Frances and Solomon, they both died within a year of each other. And when Frances Sublette died, the Sublette family had an estate sale in St. Louis City. And they had published ads in the newspapers saying that this estate sale was going on. And somebody was going through a couple years ago at another historic site here in St. Louis. He was going through the Frances Sublette estate. And sure enough, showing up in the records here is a record of U.S. Grant hiring out George from the estate of Frances Sublette for $116.35 for the year 1858. So this was a tremendous find to find out that at least there's a little bit, and elsewhere in this estate sale says that George was a 21-year-old man that had been owned by the Sublette family, but worked at Whitehaven under Grant for the 1858 calendar year. And of course, probably the most well-known connection to slavery for Grant is his ownership of William Jones. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot we don't know about this relationship. There's a lot we don't know in terms of when Grant acquired Jones or why he acquired William Jones. Based on this manumission record, which is in the original handwriting, Grant himself wrote this manumission in 1859. This record indicates that Grant did acquire William Jones from his father-in-law, Fredrick Dent. What's interesting to hear is that historians have really highlighted this as an example of Grant engaging in anti-slavery. He's freeing William Jones because he believes that slavery is wrong. And that could be true. It could be possibly true. But what I want to highlight here is that a lot of people don't know that even after William Jones was freed, Grant and his family still benefited from enslaved labor. Ulysses and Julia Grant had moved to St. Louis City in 1859. Grant tried his hand with a couple different jobs, including working in real estate. And while living in St. Louis City, there were 4 enslaved African Americans, Dan, Eliza, John, and Julia, that were sort of informally gifted to Julia Grant from her father, Fredrick Dent. So after William Jones was freed, Ulysses and Julia are still living in a house with 4 enslaved African Americans attending to their needs. And equally important, when the Grant family left for Galena, Illinois in 1860, they did not free these enslaved people. They hired them out to other people in St. Louis, with the profits going back to Fredrick Dent. So was Grant freeing William Jones an act of courage? It most certainly was. It was the right thing to do. And Grant, in freeing William Jones, he did something that other slaveholding presidents could never bring themselves to do, and that should be acknowledged. But we should be careful in how to interpret this, because Grant is still benefiting from slavery after freeing William Jones. Now, you might ask, what happened to William Jones? And the answer to that question is that we don't know. But a couple of years ago, I began doing some research, trying to figure out if I could determine what happened to Jones after he found his freedom. And I went through city directories. For those of you who do research on your ancestors, city directories can be very helpful, because they're essentially phone books in the time before phones. So they would list all the residents of a city. They would list their name, occupation, and their address. So I went to the 1860 city directory for St. Louis, and just on a whim, I decided, hey, maybe I'll find William Jones in here. And sure enough, there's actually an entry for a William Jones colored listed in the 1860 city directory. Now, he's listed in that city directory as a driver, which basically he was a horse driver. So you think about Grant's love for horses, you'd have to think that William Jones probably was really good with horses as well. So he's working the streets of downtown St. Louis being a horse driver. And he lived in 100 Myrtle Street, which is today a part of the arch grounds at the Gateway Arch. So if you look at this map from 1857, if you can see my mouse, the St. Louis courthouse where Grant frees William Jones is kind of in the middle of the green section of the map. And then there's a little red square real close to the banks of the Mississippi riverfront. That's where this William Jones was living with 5 other free people of color. Is it the same William Jones that Grant freed? Unfortunately, I've not been able to confirm that, because there is no entry in the 1860 census for a William Jones that fits the description that is listed in Grant's manumission. But it's interesting to think that Jones may have stayed in St. Louis potentially after being freed in 1859 by Grant. Okay, so let's move to the Civil War itself. Now, the Grant documentary, if you remember, when the Civil War broke out, there's a very famous letter that Grant writes to his father-in-law. And in this letter, Grant says, quote, "In all this, I can but see the doom of slavery." Now, once again, historians have kind of grabbed that line and have used it to try to argue that Grant was strongly anti-slavery, because he understood the Civil War was about slavery, and he could see that this slavery was wrong. It was the doom of slavery that led to the Civil War. This is mentioned in the Grant documentary, but there's more to the letter. Right after saying this to his father-in-law, Grant also wrote, quote, "The North do not want, nor will they want, to interfere with the institution, but they will refuse to give it protection unless the South shall return soon to their allegiance." So Grant is saying, hey, we don't want a war against slavery. We don't want to interfere with the institution. We want things to be as they are. So he's saying here, only if the South refuses to stay in the Union, only if they try to secede, then they might lose protection of slavery. But Grant is saying here, he does not want to see a war to abolish slavery here at the beginning of the war. And in fact, Grant goes even further in other letters to family members. In a letter to his wife, Julia, on May 6, 1861, Grant wrote, quote, "The worst to be apprehended is from Negro revolts. Such would be deeply deplorable, and I have no doubt but a Northern army would hasten south to suppress anything of the kind." So Grant is saying here, the biggest threat is not Confederate secession. It's not the Confederacy getting its independence from the United States. The biggest threat is enslaved African Americans leading slave revolts and causing chaos in the South. That's Grant's interpretation here. And then he went even further in a letter to his father the same day, saying, quote, "The Negro will never disturb this country again. The worst that is to be apprehended from him is now. He may revolt and cause more destruction than any Northern man, except it be the ultra-abolitionist that wants to see. A Northern army may be required in the next 90 days to go south to suppress a Negro insurrection. As much as the South had vilified the North, they would go on such a mission and with the purest of motives." So whereas Grant said to his father-in-law that the government may not protect slavery if the Confederacy seceded, he's saying to his father that even if the Confederacy secedes, he's saying a Northern army would still go down to shut down any slave revolt to prove to the Confederacy that they had no intentions of touching slavery. So this is just really interesting here because, again, Grant is taking a very conservative approach, and he really sounds like a Stephen Douglas Democrat, a Northern Democrat that is supporting the war effort and wants to stop the Confederacy, but does not want to touch slavery. I'll also add that Grant's superior officer, General Henry Halleck, headquartered out here in St. Louis with the Department of Missouri, Halleck issued General Orders Number 3 in 1861, which ordered all enslaved runaways to be returned to their enslavers. So any enslaved runaways that tried to seek refuge with the U.S. Army were ordered to be returned to their enslavers, whether or not they supported the Union or the Confederacy. And Grant, he goes along with this. He even writes to his father and says that he wished to, quote, "whip the rebellion into submission, preserving all constitutional rights," which of course implies that Grant wants to see the preservation of slavery as well. Grant does say that if the war was to become a war against slavery, let it come to a war against slavery legitimately. But of course, we might ask, what does that mean to make a war against slavery, get to it legitimately? Kind of hard to interpret what Grant means there. So the question then becomes, when did Grant start having a change of heart? When did he start thinking differently about the role of emancipation within the Union military's larger war aims? My argument would be that the real turning point was the Battle of Shiloh. So fought in April 1862, upwards of 25,000 casualties over 2 days of fighting. At that point, the bloodiest battle in the Civil War, more casualties than all previous U.S. wars combined. Grant says in his personal memoirs that he had a deep reflection in the aftermath of this battle, and he realized that the point of no return had been reached. Whereas at the beginning of the Civil War, Grant does not want to make the war against slavery because he feels that making the war an attack on slavery would further alienate Confederates and make the work of reunion more difficult. He realizes by Shiloh that the Confederates are leaving no matter what, and that ultimate conquest is the only way to go. So attacking slavery is one way to achieve ultimate conquest of the Confederacy. So this is not necessarily rooted in a moral argument. This is a war measure. It's sort of interpreted as a war measure in Grant's mind, but we start to see the wheels turning, and we start to see Grant thinking differently about slavery in the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh. Finally, by 1863, Grant comes out in support of emancipation publicly. Grant becomes his magisterial Vicksburg campaign. He defeats Confederate General John Pemberton and his forces. He gains full control of the Mississippi River for the U.S. Army. And Grant writes a number of letters in the aftermath of the Vicksburg campaign, coming out fully in support of emancipation. To Abraham Lincoln, Grant wrote that, quote, "I have given the subject of arming the Negro my hearty support. By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally. They will make good soldiers, and taking them from the enemy weakens him in the same proportion they strengthen us." So whereas Grant first views African Americans as a threat to the Union. And in fact, the biggest threat at the beginning of the Civil War through possible slave revolts. By 1863, Grant sees the wisdom of Black enlistment in the United States military and understands that African Americans are eager to offer their services, whether it's through reconnaissance or through service in the U.S. military or working as laborers on behalf of the U.S. Army. We also see the beginnings of the U.S. Army taking in enslaved refugees and caring for them in what were called contraband camps at the time. And then we also see Grant write a famous letter to Congressman Elihu Washburn. Washburn was from Grant's congressional district in Galena, Illinois, and Washburn was very close with President Lincoln. And in a letter to Washburn in August of 1863, Grant basically spilled the beans, and he said, quote, "What Vice President Alexander Stephens acknowledges as the cornerstone of the Confederacy, slavery, is already knocked out. I never was an abolitionist, not even what could be called anti-slavery before the Civil War." So there it is. Grant is admitting that he was never an abolitionist, and he may not have even been anti-slavery before the Civil War, but he now understood that the end of slavery was essential in bringing about the defeat of the Confederacy and the beginnings of a reconstruction of the United States. So Grant is willing to give up slavery as the cost of political reunion with the former Confederacy. It is important to stress here, though, that Grant really does make some unique measures during his generalship in 1863 on. As alluded to, he did support Black enlistment in the U.S. Army. He establishes contraband refugee camps along the Mississippi River during the Vicksburg campaign. And many times enslaved children are receiving an education for the first time in their lives. Women and men, adult men and women are being cared for, not always the best of circumstances, but this is remarkable in the sense that Grant is using the U.S. Army as a sort of social safety net for enslaved African Americans in the Vicksburg area who are trying to run away and seek refuge with the Army. Grant continues the suspension of prisoner of war exchanges. Sometimes defenders of the Confederacy will argue that Grant was cold-hearted in ending prisoner of war exchanges, and that at places like Andersonville, the deaths of many soldiers is responsible for Grant because he refused to exchange prisoners. However, that is probably more likely on the shoulders of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, because the Davis administration refused to acknowledge African Americans as soldiers. Captured Black soldiers were considered to be enslaved runaways, to be returned to their enslavers, or to be put to work in the Confederate camps, sometimes outright murdered and slaughtered by Confederate forces, no quarter. So Grant actually refused to exchange prisoners of war with the Confederacy because they refused to acknowledge Black African Americans as soldiers in the United States Army, deserving of the same treatment as white soldiers. Brooks Simpson famously argued that for Grant by this point, it was not the color of one's skin, but the color of one's uniform that made a difference to Grant. Finally, I'll point out that during Grant's presidency, we do see a genuine evolution in his thinking. Grant supports the 15th Amendment, opening up a pathway for African-American men to have a right to vote and to participate in elections and to run for office themselves. Grant supports a series of enforcement acts to empower the military to go in areas where lawlessness prevailed, to shut down white supremacist terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And one of my favorite quotes from Grant's presidency, he said in 1872, quote, "My oft expressed desire is that all citizens, white or Black, native or foreign born, may be left free in all parts of our common country to vote, speak, and act in obedience to law, without ostracism on account of his views, color, or nativity." So long story short, Grant had embraced this notion that regardless of one's background, the privilege of American citizenship meant that all would have the chance to vote, to act, speak, and follow the law, but to pursue liberty in any way that they chose without discrimination because of their background or because of their skin color. So My argument to you today is not that Ulysses S. Grant was always steadfastly against the institution of slavery. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest quite the opposite. But what's remarkable about the Ulysses S. Grant story with slavery is that he evolved, that he changed, that he was willing to look at the circumstances of the Civil War. He was willing to look at his previous views and to evolve and change in those views to eventually embrace not just emancipation, but the cause of racial and political equality during the Reconstruction era as well. And I'll point out too that Abraham Lincoln, Benjamin Butler, John Logan, a lot of famous Civil War figures before the Civil War also had anti-Black prejudices. Abraham Lincoln at times says things that come off pretty racist. John Logan, the famous senator and general from Illinois, Logan authored a bill to exclude African-American settlers from Illinois. After the Civil War, he supports voting rights for African-Americans. All of these men experienced changes in their views towards slavery and African Americans due to the Civil War. But I would argue that Grant went further because not only did he had these views about African Americans, but he owned an enslaved man. He appraised enslaved African Americans. He hired out enslaved African Americans and had a very intimate relationship with slavery before the Civil War. So we see a lot of ground and a lot of evolution in Grant's thinking during the Civil War. So I'll leave you with this. Frederick Douglass wrote about Ulysses S. Grant in his third autobiography. And this is after Grant had died, but Douglass came to really appreciate Grant, not just as a military leader, but as a moral leader for the United States. And I'll just quote partly from what Douglass said, but he said that, quote, Grant's pragmatism was made all the more conspicuous and striking in contrast with his West Point education and his former political associations. For neither West Point nor the Democratic Party have been good schools in which to learn justice and fair play to the Negro. So Douglass is saying Grant, having gone to the very conservative West Point Military Academy, dabbled in Democrat politics, lived on a slave plantation, he had every reason to hold prejudices against African Americans, but he was willing to work through that, his pragmatic nature during the Civil War and his embrace of civil rights during his presidency. So that is about all I have for this presentation. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. And Kelly, I'm very happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
All right, well, thank you so much for that. That was some really, a lot of information. It was packed full of information, but I loved seeing kind of the evolution of Grant's view about slavery. And I think that's something that can give us hope too, that people's opinions can change.
Yeah, if Ulysses S. Grant can do it, any one of us can do it too.
So I'm going to start out here with a question. And this is from David. He said, when President Grant appointed Elizabeth Van Lew to be the postmaster of Richmond, in your research, did you find references by Grant to Elizabeth after he left the office? She lost the position and her main source of livelihood. So can you shed any light on that?
Yeah, so I probably don't know much more than others in the room here, but yes, Elizabeth Van Lew, the famous spy for the Union from Richmond. Grant, what's really interesting is that during his presidency, in the days of the patronage system, a lot of times today it's very much based on merit and your qualifications when you apply for a federal government position, but with patronage, it's kind of who you know. And Grant uses the patronage system to appoint a record number of women as postmasters or postmistresses all over the country. So there are women working for the federal government as postmasters all around the country. And that is a way to solidify support for the Republican Party among women, even though women are not allowed to vote. This is a strategy by the Republican Party to get support from women. And I'll point out too that African Americans, this was their entry into the federal government as well, working for the post office. African Americans, a lot of them get their livelihood working for the post office, especially during Grant's presidency when the Republican Party uses the patronage system to do that. So I don't know much. I know that in Grant's papers, there are a couple mentions of Elizabeth Van Lew during his presidency. But what I can say is that Grant leaves, Rutherford B. Hayes is a Republican, Garfield, Arthur Republicans, but eventually Grover Cleveland takes office. And I have to guess that as the political parties changed, she eventually is going to be removed as the postmaster of Richmond for political considerations.
Thank you. And Mike has a question. This is not quite on the topic of Grant and slavery,
Okay.
but he asked, any idea what motivated Grant to issue his general order about the removal of the Jews from Tennessee and Mississippi?
Yeah, that's a whole separate discussion. But yes, the General Orders number 11 has to do with illegal smuggling of cotton. So the Lincoln administration put a blockade on the Confederate States and tried to sort of starve out the Confederacy economically. And one way to do that was to restrict all trade with the Confederate States in cotton. Grant's father, Jesse Grant, is an entrepreneur. Any way he can make a buck, he's going to try to do that. And Jesse Grant partnered with two Jewish brothers, the Mack brothers, out of Cincinnati. And Jesse Grant basically tried to illegally smuggle cotton from the Confederacy into the northern states. And on top of that, Jesse Grant tried to use his son's connections in the U.S. Army and basically said, hey, I know this is illegal, but with you in charge, if this is cool, we're going to bring some cotton up to the north and make a bunch of money on it. And Grant is outraged. He's outraged at his father. He can't believe that this is taking place. And rather than condemning his father, Grant condemned all Jewish people. So it's a terrible mistake. President Lincoln rescinds the order, and Grant is going to have to account for this in the election of 1868 when he ran for president. He actually wrote a letter in which he basically apologized for General Orders number 11, and he said that, quote, I do not pretend to sustain the order. So he does try to take steps during his presidency to account and atone for that mistake. And he does appoint a record number of Jewish Americans to government positions as well. But it is a stain on Grant's legacy. And, he learned that somewhere, prejudice against Jewish people. So there's a great book by Jonathan Sarna called When General Grant Expelled the Jews. It's a nice short book. It's about 150 pages. If you want to read more about General Orders 11, that is the starting point.
Excellent, thank you. And I don't know if you'll know the answer to this or not. Someone asked, was Sublette County, Wyoming, named after the Sublette family there in St. Louis?
I'm pretty sure it is. You have to double check that, but a lot of the big prominent fur traders like the Sublette family, Robert Campbell is another prominent fur trader from St. Louis. A lot of those counties out there are named after fur traders. The Astor family has a connection to St. Louis as well. Manuel, Lisa, Lewis and Clark, of course. So I'm going to say I think that is named after the Sublette family here in St. Louis.
All right. And Peggy wants to know, she said, you mentioned the Dred Scott decision, and Dred Scott ended up in Fort Snelling in Minnesota, where I live, but she can't quite remember why he ended up there. Yeah,
so Dred Scott's enslaver, John Emerson. John Emerson was a doctor for the U.S. Army. So the U.S. Army moved Dr. Emerson to, he was kind of constantly on the move and stationed at different forts. And the U.S. Army moved Emerson up to Fort Snelling. And even though Minnesota, at that time, it was a territory, the Army officers were allowed to have enslaved people. They were allowed to own enslaved people and have them on the military base. So that is how Dred and his wife, Harriet Scott, that's how they got up to Fort Snelling, because Dr. John Emerson worked for the U.S. Army.
All right. And Donald wants to know, he first says, awesome job, Nick. Really great presentation. I read that Grant and Dent family never reconciled after the Civil War over slavery. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I would go that far. I think the Grant and Dent families, some of you might have marriages with the in-laws. It's just, it's not always a great situation. But having said that, Grant himself, I would actually argue that to a certain extent, there's a level of respect and appreciation for the Dent family. A lot of you probably don't know that when Grant was elected president of the United States, Grant's father-in-law, Fredrick Dent, actually moved into the White House with the Grants. So he lived through Grant's first term in office, and they were known for having political conversations at Whitehaven, and those conversations continued in the White House dining room too. So I think there were certainly disagreements between the Grant and Dent families, but Grant seems to have a level of admiration and appreciation for his father-in-law.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think that is all the questions that came in. I don't think I missed any. I'm kind of going back through, but it looks like we've covered them all.
Okay.
So thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. And like I said, a lot of really good information. I have a feeling people will want to go to this when it's on our YouTube channel and play it again.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate that. And if you ever do find yourself in St. Louis, come on out to S.Grant National Historic Site. We'll show you around. We got the Whitehaven Estate that we do tours of every day. We have a museum. You can spend 2 minutes or 2 days in the museum. We've got an orientation film. So a lot of really cool things to see and do. We definitely encourage you to come out and visit with us if you happen to find yourself in St. Louis.
And do you happen to have any virtual programs coming up that you can mention?
Yeah, definitely. Let me see here. What I can either do, Kelly, I can either put a link to some of that stuff here, or I can send it to you later if you want to email everybody later on, whatever works for you.
If you want to put the link in the chat now, I think, or is that difficult to do?
I'm going to point everybody to our website.
Perfect.
And with our website, we have a range of educational videos that we do. Yours truly is in a number of those educational videos. I try to produce as many of those videos as I can. So there's a link to the website, and I actually have. I should do. If you have 30 seconds, I can get to the myself and a colleague. Here it is. Okay. Myself and a colleague, we did a virtual tour of Whitehaven last year, and I'm going to leave a link. Yeah, so I'm going to leave a link to that page. So we have a 5-minute virtual tour. We have a 1-hour virtual tour. So pick whichever one you like, and that'll give you some more information on Grant's life in St. Louis.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. And to our audience out there, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your continued support. And if you like what we're doing here at the American Civil War Museum, think about becoming a member. And as always, you can find more information about our programs and membership at acwm.org. Well, good night, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
The week.